All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Millennials Are Old podcast. And you know what, Brian? I was thinking, right? Last week we reviewed Feel the Darkness by Poison Idea, and I really liked that album quite a bit. And in general, I really like hardcore punk. So you know what? I thought for this week, we should review a documentary about hardcore punk, and I think I found the perfect movie. It's actually called Hardcore.
That sounds pretty informative. There'll probably be lots of information about New York and Boston and DC.
There really was. And I read a description online about the movie and I was like, this sounds perfect. And then I watched it and I was like, okay, this is a movie about a Midwestern man who just inexplicably gets tied into and just delves into the world of legal and illegal pornography. And I'm like, okay, first off, this has nothing to do with Bad Brains. This has nothing to do with Fugazi. What the fuck is
Yeah,
this?
I was really surprised when you described the premise to the movie. You said that it was a father who was very disturbed when his daughter got into hardcore. And all I could think was, boy, if my daughter got really into the germs or Department of Youth Services, I would be really proud of her.
No, I absolutely agree. I definitely wouldn't want her to get into that kind of hardcore, though.
The only hardcore I really wouldn't want her to get into is like New York hardcore because it's kind of corny with, the Cro-Mags and, the metal influences, Madball and all that shit. It's a little cringe.
I was actually going to say more the like Orange County scene. I'm just not a big fan of that scene, I'll be honest with you.
I would be pretty upset if my daughter got involved in Oxnard hardcore, Dr. No and Stalag 13.
But yeah, so speaking of young people getting into things they shouldn't be getting into, our review for this week is the 1979 classic film Hardcore. But before we get into that review, Brian, let's bring back our segment, Cringe Millennial of the Week.
Weak.
Yeah! And you know what? Of course, in our cheesy intro here, this movie is not about the hardcore scene. Unfortunately, hardcore scene of any major city. This is not the decline of Western civilization part 13. It's just not. But this is a movie about the very seedy underbelly of legal and illegal pornography. And my cringe millennials of this week, well, I should say cringe millennials to be clear, because there's actually 3 cringe millennials this time, but they all worked together to be extremely cringe.
The interesting thing is that this is the largest friend group of any millennials. These are 2 more millennial friends than any other millennial has.
That is true. These gentlemen that we are going to be talking about did not live in the age of loneliness. They were just dudes rocking together.
This sounds just really uplifting.
It really
I'm
does.
really excited to hear about this.
So,
I know
yes.
it'd even motivate me to try some new things.
Yeah. So, yes, without further ado here, so our cringe millennials of the week are the Dnipro Maniacs. And the original name for the city that they did this after was changed in 2016. It was a much longer name that I don't want to say. So I'm really happy they shortened the town name. So the Dnipro Maniacs are Ukrainian serial killers responsible for a string of murders in the city of Dnipro in June and July of 2007. Now, I think we were mentioning earlier, these aren't serial killers because serial killers need a cooling off period of at least a month. So these are spree killers. These are not serial killers. I know I'm being very technical here, but still.
I think it's a pretty important distinction. They're different patterns.
Exactly, very true, yeah. And, spree killers in general, they might get off on it, like in the sexual component, but it's mostly just like a thrill thing, whereas serial killers usually get off of it for a purely sexual reason. So I think that's a pretty distinct difference.
Yeah, I think the psychology is pretty different, and it's worth noting. A spree killer, I have to assume that though it's almost always going to be a one and done thing. Not many recurring spree killers for reasons that should be self-evident.
That almost never happens. There's one case in particular I can think of out of South Carolina where a guy committed a mass murder and then years later started being a serial killer. But that's very rare. That almost never happens. But yes, so the case gained additional notoriety because the killers made video recordings of some of their murders, with one of the videos leaking to the internet. 2 19-year-olds, the first one here being Viktor Sayenko, born in 1988, and Igor Suprunyuk, also born in 1988, were arrested and charged with 21 murders. So, of course, they would now be about 35, 36. So, prime cringe millennial category.
Oh yeah. So was this video, was it leaked onto the internet by one of the perpetrators? Do you know?
Yes, it was. It is titled, I believe, Three Guys, One Hammer, which is a video that I saw in high school. And to the audience at home, don't look it up. It's not worth it. This is a video made by two teenagers. There was a third teenager who was a co-conspirator, but he did the robberies. He didn't do the actual murders. But these two gentlemen murder an elderly man with a hammer. It's very unpleasant. Don't watch it. It's very poorly filmed. It's gross. It's obviously they fucking murdered an old man. Yeah. It's bad. It's bad in every single category. Do not watch it.
Yeah, to any listeners, especially probably younger than us, gore sites were a pretty pivotal part, I think, of the early internet for older millennials, and I guess younger Gen Xers too. I don't really know if they're a thing for Zoomers anymore. I mean, obviously there's still Live Leak and things. I know shit still exists. I don't know if gore sites have the same carte blanche that they did, which is probably for the best.
Well, actually, Brian, Live Leak shut down.
Oh, I didn't even know.
Yeah, Live Leak and Best Gore, which were two of the bigger websites, got shut down. I think Best Gore closed down voluntarily, and I think Live Leak might have been legally shut down, but I'm not entirely sure about that.
I didn't know about that, but I would, because Live Leak was up for a while, right? Because I remember...
Yeah, mid-2000s.
Yeah.
It closed down in 2021, so fairly recently.
I was a Rotten.com kid.
Ooh, I remember Rotten.com too.
Talking about the gore sites, like we have affiliations, like their forums.
Yeah.
Fuck Best Gore. I went to Rotten, bitch.
Yeah. But as I was talking about a co-conspirator earlier, there was a third co-conspirator named Alexander Hanza, born once again in 1988, was charged with 2 armed robberies that took place before the murder spree. On February 2009, all 3 defendants were found guilty. Sayenko and Sopruniuk were sentenced to life imprisonment, while Hanza received 9 years in prison. And also, this is the connection that we're going to have to our eventual trilogy of films, because spoiler alert to the film ahead, we're doing a trilogy of snuff films, or I should say movies about snuff films. And our very first entry here is...
We're doing a trilogy of snuff films.
Yes, we are.
First podcast to review snuff.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, there's probably been a series online where people have reviewed various movies about snuff films, would be my guess.
There absolutely has, I'm sure.
But the alleged reason behind their crime spree, so it says local media reported the killers had the plan to get rich from the murder videos they recorded. One suspect's girlfriend reported that they planned to make 40 separate videos of murders. This was corroborated by a former classmate who claimed he often heard Sopruniuk was in contact with an unknown, quote, rich foreign website operator, unquote, who ordered 40 snuff videos and would pay much more money once they were made. Regional Security Chief Ivan Stupak rejected the claim that the murders were committed to making internet snuff videos, saying that there was no evidence of this. Deputy Interior Minister Nikolai Kupayinsky commented, for these young men, murder was like entertainment or hunting, which I think that's personally the reason they did it. I don't think they actually thought they were going to get fucking money from this.
No, he was bullshitting. That kid was bullshitting.
100%. At the trial, it emerged that Sopruniuk collected newspaper cuttings about the case. Some photographs of the crime had captions added, including, the weak must die, the strongest will conquer. And would you believe it, these guys were also Nazis? Not surprising coming out of Ukraine, but
in
still.
Ukraine? Crazy, yeah.
Yeah, Ukrainian Nazis. Who's ever heard of anything like that? Let me not look up the Azov what is this? No.
No, I thought that Ukraine was full of like libs and people that hated Trump and Putin and they loved democracy.
They're just full of Tom Jorgensens.
Jesus Christ. Yeah.
Hey, comrade, Ivan needs his drinky. Oh, Jesus. But yeah, so just a real crash course on the concept of a snuff film to the audience at home who may not know. So a snuff film is a film purported to show either a murder or a death for the explicit purpose of making money from it. Now, there's never been an official snuff film in the idea that a big budget studio or even a small budget studio just murders people for money and makes money off of it. That's not really a thing that exists. I do believe that the idea of snuff films is very much a thing that's often traded on illicit and illegal websites. But the idea that there's some cottage industry of people making massive amounts of content for it and making massive amounts of money on it, I don't personally believe that.
I think the idea, so obviously murders and violence have been filmed. That goes without saying. And then unscrupulous people have profited from those videos. What makes that distinct from snuff, and I feel like a lot of people, kind of when you discuss it online, if you look at Reddit threads or old threads on forums about the existence of snuff films, is that for it to be snuff, in like the classic sense, it's been made specifically with the purpose of being sold for profit.
Yeah, instead of just simply people getting off to it and then they may have made money off of it later on, which I think is much more realistic, frankly. But, it's
And I guess you could like if it's snuff, then it's being distributed most likely by the people that perpetrated it. It's not like some third party that's discovered the video. It's being distributed by the killers or purveyors of violence or whatever.
exactly like the same people that purvey child sex abuse material and animal abuse material on the internet, too. It would basically be the exact same people. But yeah, so without further ado, let's get into our review of the film Hardcore. So this movie came out in 1979, was rated R. I was kind of surprised it wasn't rated X, actually, because watching this movie, there's a lot of nudity in this movie and actually like a lot of like bush. You don't see any dick, but you do definitely see a lot of bush in this movie.
I assumed that there was cuts to this movie to get it to R.
Oh, almost
Maybe,
certainly.
maybe
100%.
not, but I have to assume there was.
Almost certainly, yeah. This movie was directed and written by Paul Schrader, who, of course, is most famous for writing the screenplay for Taxi Driver. He was involved in American Gigolo, Raging Bull, the 1982 Cat People remake he directed. He also directed Mishima, A Life in Four Chapters, about the legendary Yukio Mishima, a guy who was well known for having a beautiful head that always remained attached to his body. He was also involved in The Last Temptation of Christ. He, I believe, also wrote the screenplay for the Nick Cage movie Bringing Out the Dead, which I don't know if you've ever seen Bringing Out the Dead. That movie is fucking fantastic.
I have not.
Very, very underrated Martin Scorsese movie. It's actually probably the single most underrated Martin Scorsese movie. It's fucking phenomenal. I think you would love that movie personally. He also directed Dominion, the prequel to The Exorcist. I think we might have mentioned that in the Exorcist 3 episode, but I don't remember. And recently he also directed the very critically acclaimed First Reformed movie, and he's just been involved in many, many more movies. And I also want to mention, we were talking about Nick Cage Bringing Out the Dead. He also directed 2 really awful Nick Cage movies, one called Dying of the Light and Dog Eat Dog. One movie, Dying of the Light, he described as not his movie and was literally stolen from him by his studios. And Dog Eat Dog, which he described as, I've made a lot of important movies in my life. Dog Eat Dog is not one of them.
Oh, hey, let's hold this time,
And fun fact, one of the main actors in Dog Eat Dog follows me on Twitter for some reason.
Well, you have a Cage Pod.
Yeah, what's funny?
You're a known entity in the NCU.
It was actually really funny because when we were doing the Nick Cage podcast, we had just reviewed it, I think. And Jess, our producer and, host at the time, was like, why the fuck is one of the actors from Dog Eat Dog following all of us on Twitter? And it just turns out he follows everybody on Twitter. So it's really funny to me.
Oh.
He seems like a nice guy reading his Twitter post. But yeah, he's just somebody who just follows literally everybody who's ever talked about anything involving Nick Cage. It's hilarious. Or like his movies, I should say.
Yeah, not anyone that talks about Nick Cage. He's like, oh, I just love to see what's going on in the community.
Yeah, right. And then we're talking about Paul Schrader earlier. So one of the trivia details I found is that George C. Scott and director Paul Schrader did not get along. So much that at one point, Scott refused to come out of his trailer and threatened to quit the film. Scott only agreed to come out after forcing Schrader to promise that he would never direct again.
That was, for me, about 80% of the trivia I found relating to this movie was Schrader and Scott butting heads.
George C. Scott just fucking hated him, and I don't know why.
Famously difficult man. God love him.
Yeah.
Great American actor.
100% rest in peace to George C. Scott, but he was a very difficult man to get along with from the sound of it. And also, he described it after the movie was made, he called it a piece of shit. And who also described it as a piece of shit is John Milius.
Yeah, I saw that.
And then also, George C. Scott wanted, I believe, 5 days at least of off time so he could take care of his alcoholism at the time. So, good for him.
I read that, but I wasn't clear on, was it so that he could get his drinking under control, or was it because he was drinking so much that he was exhausted?
I think, honestly, it was to take care of his drinking, although I could be wrong about that.
Okay.
But so obviously we'll get into it in the synopsis here, but I think the fact that, George C. Scott at this point was, a middle-aged-ish man. I think he was in his 50s when this movie was made. And the fact that he is a full fucking bloated alcoholic who is experiencing kind of a career slump at this point makes his portrayal in this movie so much better to me, because he just fits that archetype of Jake Van Dorn just perfectly.
Yeah, I think similar to his role in Exorcist 3, you can sense there is something in this character, whether he likes it, whether he's aware of it or admits to it or not. There's something in this character that he really captures.
For sure. And well, we'll get into who may have been in this movie in just a moment. I'll get to that once we get to the synopsis here. But it's also very fascinating because it relates to a lot of movies and media we've talked about before. But then, we were talking about directors. So this movie was produced by a gentleman by the name of Buzz Feitshans, which I don't believe that's his actual name. It sounds like a made-up character. I looked him up apparently as film credits, but I just don't believe a guy named Buzz Feitshans exists.
Yeah, that's a bony Hollywood name.
Yeah, it sounds like a fucking name that like one of the Beatles would check under hotels under or something like that.
Yes.
It does not sound like a real fucking name to me, but hey, whatever. I'll take it. And then speaking of, Buzz Feitshans is most known for producing such movies as Foxy Brown, of course, this movie, 1941, Conan the Barbarian, First Blood, Uncommon Valor, Red Dawn, Rambo 2 and 3, Total Recall, Tombstone, and Die Hard with a Vengeance. So this guy has quite the filmography.
Yeah, pretty storied career.
Yeah, and I think Die Hard with a Vengeance was one of his last movies, so he has not been involved in Hollywood in quite some time. But you know what? You got to go on top by producing, what was that, the third Die Hard movie?
The third one, 1993, is that right?
I think so, yeah. Something like that, somewhere in the early to mid-90s. And this movie is about 108 minutes long. I was not able to find any budget or box office information. I was kind of surprised by that. I actually looked for about 10 or 15 minutes, but I couldn't find any information on any website about that, which I was kind of surprised about, to be honest with you. But hey, whatever. Nobody shows it. Nobody sees it.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. To see this movie at the time of its release, you had to go actually to a peep show.
Yeah, exactly. And then talking about movies people see at peep shows. So on Rotten Tomatoes, this movie has a 76% critic score and a 67% audience score. So I guess most critics and most audiences don't think of this movie as a piece of shit like John Milius and George C. Scott did. I genuinely don't understand why George C. Scott just was such an asshole. I don't understand. Or Paul Schrader. I don't know. Either way.
Well, for Scott, I have to assume that, he was too close to the project to see it objectively, and he was having a bad time. Like, this was just a bad time for him, and the movie is tied to that bad time. So maybe he was never going to see it as good, And he hated the director. Sounds like for personal reasons, he hated Schrader. And so he's going to bring that to whatever the finished product is. Milius, I don't know. I don't know what his problem is.
Well, I mean, Milius was a very noted reactionary, so maybe he just hated that, like, porn is being shown and, like, sex workers are humanized or something.
I mean, this movie, I like this movie. I think there is definitely a progressive read of this movie, but there is definitely a reactionary read of this movie that's valid. So that's very interesting to me.
Oh, no, I totally agree either way, but I would guarantee you, because of course, conservatives and reactionaries are fucking awful at analyzing media. I wouldn't be surprised if he hated it for that reason. I wouldn't be surprised at all.
The acknowledgement that porn existed.
And like sex workers are human and have human emotions. I don't know.
They experience life as humans do.
Yeah. But, speaking of people who experience life as humans do, let's get into the synopsis here. So, in December 1977, Jake Van Dorn, once again played by George C. motherfucking Scott, as I'm going to call him here, legendary actor, love seeing him in everything. I've literally never seen a bad George C. Scott movie. I just haven't. It's just, I don't even think
he is one of the greatest actors of all time.
100%. Didn't he win Best Actor for Patton?
Just fantastic. We'll do more George C. Scott in the future, I'm sure, just to talk about. He was also in Day of the Dolphin, if you've seen that.
I've heard of it, but I have not seen it, I'll be honest with you. I was actually going to do at one point The Changeling, which is a movie that I think this was the next movie after Hardcore.
That's correct.
Which Changeling, you said you haven't seen Changeling, right?
No, I haven't.
Ooh, it is a classic supernatural horror movie. It's probably my single favorite supernatural horror movie ever. It's fucking fantastic.
Ooh, interesting.
So yeah, very, very good movie. I actually just watched it maybe sometime last year, I want to say, again. I've seen it several times, but I've seen it the most recent time, like maybe last year-ish. But no, very good movie. So, and the original fact I had here that I was mentioning earlier, so Warren Beatty was originally attached for this movie, but Paul Schrader, of course, wanted Jake Van Dorn to be the father figure, whereas Warren Beatty wanted to be a guy looking for his missing girlfriend. And for this kind of movie, it just does not make any fucking sense. It just doesn't. It makes no sense.
And obviously, we are on record, both of us, as Beatty fans. He's in the same league for me as George C. Scott, just a great American actor. First of all, his whole deal doesn't really fit with this character. But also, if you change the character, that you're in pursuit of from a daughter to a girlfriend, it changes the whole movie. Changes the whole emotional center, changes the whole dynamic. It doesn't work.
it just does not work at all. So I'm really glad that Paul Schrader really kept firm on that. And to be fair, Paul Schrader mentions he lost a lot of possible funding for this movie. He, of course, lost a giant star at the time, Warren Beatty. Of course, I think just a year or two later, he would direct Reds. I mean, like, Warren Beatty was like at the fucking top of his career in 1979, or when this movie was starting to make production in, like, I think 1976. He was at the top of his fucking game. But, it is what it is. He held firm, and I still like the movie that he ended up making. So, Paul Schrader, you've made a lot of terrible decisions in your life when making movies, but I don't think this was one of them. Good job.
And he ended up with George C. Scott, one of the only actors on Beatty's level at that time, I would say.
Oh, absolutely, 100%.
So it's not like he had to downgrade. He found someone better suited for the role than Beatty.
Exactly. But yeah, so Jake Van Dorn is a prosperous local businessman in Grand Rapids, Michigan, who has strong Calvinist convictions. And there's a couple little fun facts. So they did film the opening scenes of this movie in Grand Rapids. They actually used his old, I think, grade school and an old factory for settings of this movie that he attended school and worked at that factory. And also there's a scene in about 3 minutes in where somebody's shoveling snow on their doorstep. And that was actually Paul Schrader's real life father. So I thought that was really adorable.
Aw, just got some footage of him doing dad stuff.
Exactly. Although initially when they were filming this movie, I think the original title was called Pilgrim or something like that, which is of course a thing that Jake Van Dorn gets called in the movie quite a few times. But apparently locals were not happy to find out what this movie was actually based on. And when it happened, there was a bit of a local boycott and people were very, very upset when it happened. Because of
in keeping with the themes of the movie.
Exactly. So just to give a little context of Grand Rapids. So Grand Rapids is a city in, lower Michigan. It's close to Lake Michigan. I think it's actually just a little bit away from Muskegon, which is the other city that's connected to the boat ferry, which I would love to take the boat ferry here in Milwaukee one day, but it's very expensive. I'll find a way to do it someday. But anyways, Grand Rapids is a city that has a very, very strong religious tradition, particularly Calvinism, which from what I understand about Calvinism, it's a very predeterminist Protestant faith. So it's one of the more conservative and strict mainstream Protestant.
One of my good friends' father wrote an essay about Calvinism because he has his own church and he doesn't like Calvinism. So yeah, the whole deal with it, just the long and short, because it is important to this movie. Calvinists believe that from the beginning of time to the end, there is a list of people who will be saved, who will go to heaven. And God knows who they are already, and that it's predetermined and fixed and cannot be changed, no matter what we do. That is basically Calvinism.
Yes, very similar to Jehovah's Witnesses, because Jehovah's Witnesses have that predetermined streak in them as well. But yeah, so he is a single parent. Van Dorn is the father of a seemingly quiet, conservative teenage girl, played by the actress Isla Davis. Her name in the movie is Kristen. Now, interestingly enough, this movie was her only ever film role, and you can clearly tell because once we see her at the end of the movie, she is a fucking horrendous actress. She is really bad. I think she plays a good job at being a sort of pissy, naive little girl who gets, manipulated into something that, she is just in way over her head, I guess. But
she's bad.
Yeah, she's just bad.
Did you read the quote about how she was cast specifically because of her look?
Yeah, wasn't it that she wasn't particularly attractive, if I'm not mistaken?
This is such a shitty thing to say. Dude says, I cast her because she's not traditionally attractive, so she's the type of girl that would be lured by flattery. I was like, well, that's fucked up to say about this, little girl.
Well, what's fucked up, too, is that one of the main characters in this movie that we interact with later on in the movie, they also wanted a different actress, but they said she wasn't attractive enough to play that character either. So this happened multiple times in this fucking movie. Yeah, and rest in peace, Isla Davis. She actually died, I think, in 2009, if I'm not mistaken. So she's been dead for quite a while, unfortunately. But rest in peace. You were in a really good George C. Scott, Paul Schrader movie, but you weren't very good in it. So
she's fine. So it's not like when I watch her, I'm not like, oh, she's so awful. But
it doesn't ruin the experience, but it is just sort of she's having to act opposite of fucking George C. Scott. I mean,
yeah. And clearly she didn't really want to do much acting because she would have done something else after this if she'd wanted to.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I think what I read is that she was a stripper beforehand and she just got hired for this role, I guess. So.
Okay.
But yeah, so she inexplicably disappears when she goes on a church-sponsored trip to Bellflower, California, specifically to Knott's Farm, where she disappeared, which is a, big amusement park in California, if I'm not mistaken. Not like Disneyland, but, fairly big. With the help of his brother-in-law, Wes, played by the actor Dick Sargent, which I just love that name, by the way. That's such a good fucking actor name.
That is such a good old-timey bony Hollywood name.
Yeah. And I also love how these guys, they play, Dutch reformist guys, of course, George C. Scott and Dick Sargent, but they're the most like fucking Scots-Irish motherfucking looking guys you've ever seen.
Yeah.
They don't look
fucking
Midwestern. They don't look Midwestern Central European at all.
No, they have fucking potato face.
Yeah. They look like their moms. I'm not going to get into that. That's a really mean thing I was going to say. There was this insult against this Irish girl at one point where it was like, no, I'm not going to get into it. It's very offensive. We're already getting into some offensive stuff. But either way, yes, they have potato face. They are the most like fucking Irish, British Isle looking motherfuckers of all time. They don't look
bulbous nosed motherfuckers.
Yeah, they don't look 1% German, like nothing. Like their ancestors never left the British Isles. They never even met like the Roman conquerors. They look so fucking British. It's hilarious. But either way, whatever.
You know that monkey that is called the tropical monkey that they call the English monkey?
Oh yeah, it's like red face and shit. Yeah.
That's them.
Oh God. But yes, so Van Dorn hires Andy Mass, played by, once again, R.I.P. to a legend, Peter Boyle.
Peter Boyle.
Fucking absolutely. I mean, everybody, of course, knows him from Everybody Loves Raymond, but I know him from Taxi Driver and this motherfucking movie. But yeah, very legendary.
He had a couple years there where he was really chasing that, getting in some pretty heavy movies.
Oh, no, absolutely. Yeah. And of course, he's fucking great in this movie, too, as an eccentric private investigator in Los Angeles to locate Kristen. After 5 months pass, in May 1978, Mast unexpectedly visits Van Dorn in Grand Rapids and shows him an anonymously produced 8mm stag film he located in a Los Angeles sex shop. The film, which shows Kristen having sex with two young men, shocks and disturbs Van Dorn, who comes to believe that his daughter has been kidnapped and indoctrinated into sex work. Now, I do want to talk about the specific scene where fucking Mast makes Jake watch the actual film, because, like, you see his befuddled face. He's like, wait, what? And then, you see Kristen take off her top and then, gets Eiffel Towered by these two guys. Like, they don't actually show it, but it's basically implied. Yeah. And, like, his abject horror at watching this and, like, him just mentally breaking down after and just screaming, like, just make it stop, turn it off, whatever. He's, like, breaking down crying is one of my favorite movie scenes of all time. I love it. And then you just hear, there's no music. All you hear is just the 8mm film going and just his anguished expression and noises. It's phenomenal. I love it.
Yeah, that's a great scene.
It's very similar, and of course, spoilers to the audience ahead, but our next review is going to be the Nick Cage film 8mm, which a lot of people say is a ripoff of this movie. I don't really agree with that, but
I don't agree.
There's definitely some very similar beats in that movie that are similar to this, and that scene in 8mm, I think, is even better, but they're both phenomenal scenes, and I just love how it's basically almost all show, no tell, except for, obviously, him saying, turn it off.
And it's kind of like you are put in the position of the viewer of the 8mm film. You have the remove from it where you get to experience their response, but you're also put in that room with them watching this unsettling film. Well, unsettling to him in this case. I don't know. Yeah. It's whatever to me.
Yeah. Well, to be fair, I mean, of course, he's very conservative in this movie, so he'd probably hate it no matter what. But, just seeing your daughter on top of it, that would, especially having gone missing, I would just, I would react the exact same way.
And I don't know if they ever outright say it. My understanding of the character in this film is that she's underage. I don't know if she is.
They do. Actually, there's a later scene that I want to expound upon when it's featured in a later scene, like reincorporation. I think that's the correct term, but whatever. Anyways, a callback to an earlier scene. That's what I meant to say. But they do mention explicitly that this is a jailbait movie. So I do think
Oh, that's right. That's right. Yeah, so, you're right.
They don't really express it too much for, once again, another reason I'm going to talk about later on, but I do believe she's underage when this movie
Yeah, you're right. I forgot about the jailbait line. Yeah, you're correct.
But yeah, so after that scene, Van Dorn travels to Los Angeles, visiting various sex shops and peep shows in hopes of locating Kristen. And I love a lot of these scenes where he's looking in vain to find, to find any information, really. Because Mast says in an earlier scene, we were joking about it, but it's, nobody shows it, nobody makes it, nobody sees it. And that's kind of what his whole search is. Like, he's searching in vain for something that he knows nobody's ever going to tell him information on willingly. So he's going to all these sex shops, he's showing pictures like, do you know this woman? And everybody's just like, I don't fucking know anything about that. Get that shit out of my face. Like, at one point he pays 50 cents just for entrance, and the guy just goes, I don't want your fucking 50 cents. Get the fuck out of here. Like, that's just how hostile people are to this, like, guy just trying to find his fucking daughter. Like, it's horrible.
Well, I want to say, like, we say it's horrible because we know what the character of Jacob Van Horn is going through. But my thought watching this, and it's one of the things that, and I like this movie a lot. I think it's really well done. It's really emotionally affecting. I do kind of think what it's trying to say gets a little muddled at various points. And one of the things I was thinking is, well, from the perspective of pretty much all these people, this guy is just an asshole.
An asshole.
He's yelling at them. He's coming in. He's dressed like a fucking cop. Like, he is.
Yes, he is dressed like a cop. Absolutely.
He's dressed like a cop. He's making demands of all these people who, for, working at a sex shop is basically a guy with a retail job. He's coming in, basically asking questions, pushing this girl's picture in their face. And they don't know what this guy wants with this girl. They don't, even if they knew her, which they probably don't. Why would they give this guy any information? Yeah. He seems like a psycho.
Yeah. After all, this guy could be there just to kidnap this girl too. You don't fucking know. Like, it could be for good or nefarious purposes.
Yeah.
So you don't know. Obviously, we know from his perspective he's just trying to find his daughter, but not everybody fucking knows that. But yeah, so with no results from Mast's investigation, where I also love the scene where he finds Mast at his apartment and he's like, trying to, rizz up a young lady that he paid for, obviously.
Yeah.
And he's like, is this what you're doing with all the extra money that I'm giving you? And he's like, you know what, man, I'm just doing some research. Yeah.
Peter Boyle's so fucking good in this. He's such a fucking D's.
Yes. And then I also love, he's like, get out. And he's like, but this is my apartment. He's like, get out. He kicks him out of his own apartment. That's
great George C. Scott read.
Yeah. But yeah, so once again, no results from that, or even from Los Angeles's sex shopkeepers and rap parlor women. A desperate Van Dorn posts an advertisement and disguises as a pornography producer of the Los Angeles Free Press, hoping to find information about his daughter. So this does skip a couple of those scenes, so I want to go real quick. So at one point, Mast finds a porn producer, porn distributor who's making a movie, and he's like, hey, here's this movie about this jailbait. You go to jail for that. And he's like, I don't make those kind of movies, whatever, blah, blah, blah. So that guy comes back later on. So I do want to mention that real quick. But yeah, we were talking earlier about how more than likely this was illegal pornography. And that character, like I said, will definitely come back. But I just wanted to establish that real quick. After many porn actors visit Van Dorn's motel, a scraggly actor named Jism Jim, played by the actor Will Walker, who was in the 8mm stag film with Kristen, who Jake then beats up, appears and knows where she might be.
We need to point out the amazing outfit that
Van Dorn is wearing. The most cop outfit of all time.
It's awesome.
He's wearing the shittiest gray wig and the shittiest bushy mustache you've ever
seen. And
a
purple tie-dye t-shirt. He just looks like George C. Scott in a wig and a fake mustache and a tie-dye shirt. And he's talking like the same. And he's like, hey, Matt,
Yeah.
In that scene, I can understand in that moment why George C. Scott would see that scene and say that the film is a piece of shit. If you're an actor like that who has a very serious, probably self-image, a very classical sense of American film in Hollywood, and you see yourself in that goofy wig and that mustache and that tie-dye shirt, you'd go, this is a piece of shit. I can understand from that man's perspective why he felt that way in that moment.
No, absolutely. I totally can see that too. And there's also, so he interviews a bunch of guys, and one of them is a big black guy with an afro who goes by Big Dick Black. And I looked up that actor. His name is Hal Williams. And I didn't put him in the synopsis here just because he's only in a minute long scene, but his scene's absolutely hilarious. So he's like, wait, you don't want to hire me because I'm black, basically? And he's just a great actor. But I looked up his picture right now, and no joke, he looks like, okay, I'm going to give this a context here. So this modern picture of him looks like if back in the 1960s or whatever, if Corn Pop killed Joe Biden and then absorbed his powers.
Holy shit!
That's what he looks like.
Holy shit, he does!
Yeah! He looks like a Corn Pop 1 absorbed him and became a senator. Like when Joe Biden talks about black people voting for him, I think that's what he thinks he looks like in the mirror.
I realized as I pulled up his picture, I heard what you were saying and I figured it out and I was like, oh my God.
Yeah. Oh, God damn it. He also looks like Kid Cudi's character in X.
In this film, he does look similar to the character, Kid Cudi's character in X. Probably just what a lot of black porn stars looked like in the 70s.
That's actually a really good point. But yeah, so after he beats up Jim, he basically is just like, oh, that fucking whore, she did this to me. And of course, Jake beats the fuck out of him. And then he's like, oh, I know where she is, blah, blah, blah. And then Jim directs Van Dorn to Nikki, played by the actress Susan Hubley. Now, that was the person who was supposed to be played by a different actress, but that different actress just apparently wasn't hot enough to be in this role. Just awful.
Rude.
Just rude as shit.
Luckily, the actress they got is also very good in this.
She is actually very good in this movie, 100%. So, good on them. But yeah, so she is a prostitute and occasional porn actress whom he claims may know Kristen's whereabouts. Upon meeting, Nikki says she has seen Kristen before and may be able to find her through her connections. Van Dorn pays Nikki to accompany him in his search. Chasing a rumor that Kristen was now filming porn in Mexico, their uneasy alliance moves from Los Angeles to San Diego, and the two gradually warm up to each other. Nikki feels protected by Van Dorn because he is a man who does not see her as merely a sex object, and he is able to speak openly to her about his deepest feelings, such as his wife leaving him. The two also discuss their wildly different views on religion and sex, which I love those scenes, by the way, because Jake is literally just trying to tell her his beliefs in a way that's not rude or disrespectful. He's like, this is matter of fact what I believe. She says, this is a matter of fact what I believe. And it's like, okay, well, we're not going to agree, but, agree to disagree, basically. He is a conservative, he's the most fucking, tolerant conservative Christian I think maybe ever portrayed in a movie.
Well, he's maybe, I guess, a very classic idea of conservatism. This is, I think, how conservatives see themselves. So it makes sense that a protagonist in a movie would be that way.
Very true, yes. And then also, I totally forgot to mention, so there's one scene earlier on where Jake is still investigating. He hasn't quite meeten, Big Dick Blackergism Jim yet, where he goes to that porn producer I was talking about that Mast first interacts with, and he disguises himself. And this disguise is even better because it's literally just sunglasses, so that's hilarious. And he uses his first name and his, what was that, cousin's last name?
Yeah.
Or brother-in-law or whatever his last name. So he's like, I'm Jake DeVries. And it's just the most fucking fake ass bullshit of all time, but whatever. And, he talks to him I want to make a big picture and blah, 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 blah. And I have $50,000 and help fund this porn movie. And the guy goes well, listen, I don't need a partner, but if you want any of my advice, I would start in the kiddie porn and then go up higher. And it's and he doesn't really react to this information. He's like, oh, that's a good idea. Of course, he's in disguise at this point. But I do want to elaborate on that scene specifically, because that scene, I think to a modern audience is oh my God, he really just said that. And, of course, he's a sleazy porn producer or whatever. But, once again, this movie came out in 1979. It began, I think the writing process began when he was working on Taxi Driver.
76.
So yeah, 76-ish. And doing some research, child pornography, which I'm just going to call it child sex abuse material, because that's what it is. I mean, it's just abuse material, obviously. But child sex abuse material was not illegal federally in the U.S. until 1977. And our modern child sex abuse material laws weren't really solidified until the mid-80s. So a lot of people who got involved in the adult industry oftentimes worked in child sex abuse material in that time frame, and it was kind of seen as, obviously gross, and you just wouldn't bring that up in polite conversation, but it was a thing that was relatively open. You could go to sex shops in America and especially in Europe in the 70s and even up until the early to mid 80s and just find that somewhere. It wasn't seen as that big of a deal.
And that goes also for, things involving, animal abuse, violent pornography. And it's not that there wasn't levels to, how scandalous something was, but I would say that kind of that's how it was. And the other thing, it was that porn is a seamy underworld, and there's mainstream porn, and then there's seamier porn. But in this kind of Wild West where the legality of it is either all open or at best kind of gray and blurry, it kind of always allowed to exist on the same level, which, a lot of times we watch things from the 70s and we think, oh, it doesn't really seem that long ago. But boy, this aspect of this movie makes this feel like a million years ago.
It really does. Absolutely. And like, talk about some things in mainstream movies. I mean, Brooke Shields was an actress who was portrayed nude multiple times in movies. She literally did a Playboy spread when she was like fucking 12 years old or something. Like this level of child sex abuse was fairly normalized. Like obviously not mainstream, as I said earlier, but like you could just go and find this in a mainstream fucking sex shop.
I think there's some parallels. I'm going to get a little heady here. Cut me off if this sounds stupid.
Okay.
There's some parallels almost to Weimar Germany, where, like, so out of the 60s, you've got all this sexual liberty and all this kind of opening up of conversations and acceptability and boundaries pushing, which is largely good, right? But in this time, there's all these changes happening, and that allows a lot of questionable or downright disgusting things to kind of work in. And people, maybe in a little bit of a moment, maybe the mass culture isn't quite sure how to respond.
That's true. I mean,
I know that maybe that sounds like I'm not taking it to task as much, but that's kind of what I think it was. It was, well, we're opening up, all these different types of sex, like queer sex and interracial sex and things. And like, you're kind of like the wider society is deciding where the new limits are. And so there's a period of time where all of this is kind of in flux.
No, you're absolutely correct. I mean, NAMBLA, which is of course like a meme organization now, but NAMBLA was born out of the gay liberation movement of the 60s and early 70s. That's just the reality. And obviously now we see that as, abhorrent, and 99.9% of LGBT people consider that abhorrent as well, but it does have its origins in the gay liberation movement. That's just true.
And it seems like, I mean, it's a very small group. I mean, within the wider group of pedophiles, the group of people that openly advocate for themselves is, for obvious reasons, much smaller. But it does seem like every 10 or 15 years, there is a movement of people kind of trying to get back into like queer and gay liberation spaces.
Yeah.
And every 10 or 15 years, the wider community has to step in and just say no.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. Like, there's that whole, I think we made it on an earlier episode, but the whole like maps thing, which I think is mostly like a 4chan psyop, but there's absolutely been real people who have like,
I mean, there has. And kind of bring it back, I think, to the themes with Van Horn. One of my thoughts when you and I were talking about this privately, Taylor, was I guess for Van Horn, all of these things are degenerate. All of these things to him are repugnant. So to him, and this, we like his character. We, in a lot of ways, sympathize with him. But from his Calvinist perspective, he's journeying into this world of pornography. And to him, it's probably not that far removed that these people peddle children or whatever. He's thinking probably, oh, of course they do.
Oh, yeah. No, he's probably like, oh, yeah, two adult people, sucking each other off. That's exactly the same thing as, showing a kid getting abused on film. He probably thinks it's essentially the same thing. But yeah, so the unlikely pair ends up in San Francisco, where Van Dorn learns that Kristen may be in the hands of Rattan, played by the actor Mark Alimo, a dangerous sadomasochistic porn player who also produces snuff films on the black market. Nikki directs Van Dorn to Todd, played by the actor Gary Graham, a dealer and associate of Rattan. The two meet in a sex shop where Van Dorn feigns interest in Rattan's latest snuff film, of which Todd arranges a screening in a back room of the shop. Fearing the film may show the murder of his own daughter, Van Dorn reluctantly agrees to view it. Van Dorn is horrified by the footage, which shows Rattan stabbing a man to death before slashing the throat of a Mexican prostitute in a Tijuana motel room, but is relieved to find that the victim is not Kristen. So that's why I wanted to cover this. So of course, there's some themes in this movie that I think are kind of muddled, and I know we talked about this a little bit, but ultimately, I think this movie is about Van Dorn, of course, being thrown into the world of legal and then eventually illegal pornography, and his sort of like, I guess, descent into madness, if you will. Like he's going into like a deeper circle of hell every time he's trying to find what may be in vain his own daughter. Like that's my sort of read on it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I guess I think what gets muddled for me is what I think the film is trying to say through that.
So I actually had a thought process just before we started recording. So in real life, Paul Schrader once again grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He grew up in a very strict Calvinist household. He wasn't really allowed to have any sort of like secular friends or really watch any movies or anything like that. And I think when Paul Schrader eventually ended up in the film industry, he saw for the first time what was essentially like the flooding of just years and years and years of like, secular big city culture coming from, very conservative, I would even say naive sort of Midwest less religious upbringing. And I think that sort of portrayal of Jake Van Dorn's character is, I think, fairly autobiographical. So I think he's more just a strict autobiographical telling of maybe his sort of like being thrust into this kind of world, if that makes sense.
Interesting. I guess my feeling about what Schrader's trying to say is that I sort of get the sense that we're supposed to see Van Horn kind of reckoning with his own perception of the world and maybe like the limitations of his Calvinism. There are points in the movie where, well, I kind of assume that's what the movie's trying to say. I mean, there is a lot in this film that kind of, not just Van Horn doesn't understand pornography, but the film kind of doesn't seem to understand the subculture. And sometimes it does come off to me as a little bit reactionary, which is kind of funny because I feel like by 79, the general audience for this film would not be that shocked by most of the things on screen. Like porn by that point is pretty mainstreamed.
Yeah, no, like conservative people aren't seeing this movie. These are like the precursor of what in the 80s they would call like slasher movie fans, like people of like genre film people. Like no moral panic, like fucking satanic panic people are seeing this kind of movie. Let's be real here.
Yeah, I mean, the poster for the film is a black theater screen that says, "What if that was your daughter?" on screen. And then in the corner is George C. Scott weeping.
Oh, no.
And then there's the word hardcore. Like,
it actually says, "Oh my God, that's my daughter." That's what it says.
Oh, that's it. That's it.
Which, of course, is a line that's never actually said in the movie, but it's such a iconic tagline that people believe it's from this movie.
So glad it's not. Can you imagine? Oh my God.
No, honestly, I love the poster. It's legitimately one of my favorite movie posters of all time. It is just
it's fantastic.
Phenomenal. And also another thing that might have been the basis of this movie. So there's an apocryphal story that Paul Schrader says where in Grand Rapids there was a girl who, came from a strict religious family who ended up in a porn film shot in California, and that became like kind of a local scandal. So I think that was part of the inspiration for it as well. He's like, I saw that. I'm like, oh, got to put it on my fairly autobiographical movie.
Well, and a cool, there's lots of cool lines in here that, we couldn't name all of them. One of my favorite ones is actually in the opening scene. They're at a Thanksgiving dinner and a bunch of little kids are watching television, and a friend of their family, I don't know if it's like brother-in-law or what, who's this grumpy guy, is, kind of chiding these children for watching TV. And he says, oh, all the kids from here, they run away to California and they make these TV shows and I hate them.
Yeah, I do remember that line. That one made me laugh. I didn't catch that on my first watch, but yeah, it's a pretty funny one. But yeah, so back to the synopsis here. So Van Dorn returns to the hotel where he is staying with Nikki and asks that she divulge Todd's address. Nikki, having grown close to Van Dorn and secretly hoping he can help her escape her life on the streets, finds herself fearful of being forgotten once Van Dorn locates Kristen. As a result, she initially refuses to tell him Todd's address. Van Dorn loses his temper and strikes her, after which she reluctantly reveals the information. So I actually do want to talk a little bit about that too. So she once again wants out of this life. She thinks Van Dorn is kind of her way out of this life, because he's a wealthy businessman from a small Midwest town. She grew up as a child prostitute. She talks about that openly, on the streets of Los Angeles or San Diego or wherever the hell, right? And Mast comes into the hotel room where they're staying at, and he's just like, oh, you think he gives a shit about you? He's going to forget you the second he finds his daughter. And that sort of like, implants an idea. It's like, oh, am I going to be like abandoned and forgotten like everybody else? And so she, during the scene, is literally just doesn't want to tell him any information that she knows, because she literally thinks that the longer this can go on, the more likelihood she can just, fucking get out of this shitty situation. And it's really tragic, like watching this.
It's devastating.
It is really fucking devastating. So Van Dorn tracks Todd to a seedy bondage fetish house and forces Todd to tell him where he can find Rattan. When Todd refuses, Van Dorn viciously beats him and he ultimately offers Rattan's location. Van Dorn and Mast track Rattan to a nearby nightclub where Kristen and he are observing a live sex show. When Van Dorn confronts Rattan, Kristen flees and Rattan slashes Van Dorn with a knife. As Rattan is running out, Mast shoots Rattan as he flees the nightclub, and Rattan collapses and dies in the entryway to a porn theater as horrified pedestrians watch just as the police arrive. Now, I think this scene's also interesting because it's not really said in the movie, but I think the implication here is that Rattan is recruiting a new girl for his snuff film, and Kristen just happens to be there. And if Van Dorn wasn't there, Kristen might have actually ended up being in the next fucking snuff film. Like, it's a pretty horrifying scene when, in my opinion, my interpretation breaks down like that.
I hadn't thought of that. That is interesting.
Because, I mean, when you rewatch the movie, I mean, he's literally like right behind her as they're watching this. So it
Yeah.
theoretically could have been like a new, like fucking grooming a new prospect for this. So yeah, pretty rough stuff. In the nightclub basement, Van Dorn finds a cowering Kristen. He tells her that he will take her home from the people he believes forced her into pornography, but she responds with anger, stating that she made her decisions of her own volition and that she felt loved and appreciated in a way that the emotionally distant Van Dorn never offered. So in this scene here, and we talked about it last night, so I've seen a lot of people who have watched this movie online, and they talk about how Van Dorn was a bad father, this and that, blah, 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 and she, blah, blah, blah. But like we mentioned explicitly, she is a minor who was groomed into this, maybe even kidnapped outright, but was groomed into this. And she's responding in a way that a grooming victim would when their parent finds them in a situation. Like Jake Van Dorn, I'm not going to say he's the world's best dad, but for a conservative Christian, like silent generation guy, he was a pretty good dad by those fucking standards, at least from what we see in the movie. Like, you know, not a very emotionally available guy, but like, you know, he's not beating his daughter all the time or anything like that.
And he seems actually reasonably affectionate. He at least seems like capable of warmth.
Yeah, I mean, when she, you know, calls him names and yells at him and talks about how he never appreciated her or whatever, like he's breaking down in tears. Like a guy of that age crying after like an emotional moment, like that would have never happened. Like a dad would have just like beaten her, grabbed her by the hair and just dragged her up the stairs. Like, I mean, seriously.
Yeah.
Like, you fucking whore, come back home. Like that's what would have happened.
I definitely agree that Kristen is parroting lines that she's been groomed to believe, and that Van Horn is a pretty good, probably a pretty standard, and maybe even better than average Christian Calvinist father. We talked about this last night. I don't think she should come home with him. Not because he doesn't deserve it, but because I kind of think it undercuts the movie.
Yes, actually. So I do want to talk a little bit about the original ending. So the original ending was eventually, I would say probably around the time when they find Rattan. I assume he kills Rattan in the original script, but he never actually finds Kristen. And going back to Grand Rapids, later on, he finds out that she died in a car accident. That was the original ending. Paul Schrader wanted an ending similar to Chinatown. That was what he originally said.
The ghost of Chinatown looms so large over this movie, like at every moment.
And he essentially caved to studio pressure because the studio wanted a more happier ending. And he regrets that. I personally don't dislike the ending very much. Like, I know a lot of people like violently hate the ending in this movie. Even Paul Schrader hates the ending of this movie. I don't really hate it. I don't think it makes a lot of sense for the themes of this movie, but it's a fine ending. I don't hate it.
Well, and I do understand, because there are a lot of times with films where you watch the protagonist or a character that you come to have some affection for go through all of this hardship just to have victory snatched from the jaws, or defeat snatched from the jaws of victory, as they say. I don't particularly like the Schrader original ending because it feels a little bit too red herring. What I guess I expected to see, and what I think would maybe for me reinforce, what I feel like the movie kind of says about the type of man Van Horn is if Kristen just doesn't come home with him, as far as we know, and he's kind of left like hanging there to like reckon with whatever it is about him or the life he gave her, which probably wasn't bad. Probably was in most anyway better than the life she's chosen. But like, what was it that made her leave that? Because to me, the most interesting stuff are the things hinted at where Van Horn is kind of fighting to hold on to his faith because he's in such an insane situation where it's like his once very firm grasp on everything. There are these moments where he sort of feels tried,
No, absolutely. And also, just to get the ending quick out of the way. So, of course, Kristen does, of course, come back home, or at least is willing to. I think the line that he says is, well, how about you take me home then? And like offers his like kind hand and a warm face, which I love that line, by the way. That is a fantastic
Yeah, that's nice.
line. Which, in my opinion, I think shows that he's not a bad father. Like, he is willing to concede that he may have made some wrong decisions and he will, give her, not necessarily give her a second chance, but more, she gives him a second chance, I guess.
Yeah.
So, like, in my opinion, once again, I don't think he's a bad dad. I think he's once again, a guy who, due to the limits of the world that he was born into,
yes,
couldn't be the type of dad that she would want from him. But I don't think he's a bad dad or even a bad person necessarily.
And probably a better dad than anyone else in that community she's in could expect or hope for.
No, for sure. Absolutely. But then, so after leaving the club, Van Dorn spots Nikki among the crowd of onlookers. He begins to make a token offer of gratitude, but it is clear to both to him and her usefulness has ended, and thus their relationship is now over. She walks away, resigned to continuing her life on the streets. Now, I know a lot of people hate this particular aspect of the ending too, but like, I don't know. It's one of those
It just
things.
seems more realistic to me.
It does 100%. I mean, they come from two different worlds. I mean, realistically speaking, like, even if, Jake had brought her back to Grand Rapids or whatever, that doesn't really fix her issues. She's got way more issues than just needing a new location and a new start in life. This girl has an entire life of sexual and physical and emotional trauma. You know what I mean?
But also, Van Horn was never going to do that. He may have some affection for her, some appreciation for her, but she's still basically a stranger. And just a guy that age from that community, he's not going to bring this strange girl in and say, you know what I mean?
He's like, hey, here's this girl with a weird past, and we're gonna go to fucking Grand Rapids.
You can blame him or not. You can say that it's a bad thing of him or not. It doesn't really matter.
I think it's a fairly morally neutral opinion, to be honest.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
I saw a particular YouTuber who I'm subscribed to, who was actually from Milwaukee originally, but he doesn't live in Milwaukee anymore. And he was
There's the worst.
Thankfully, it's not Durst. Did I tell you I saw him biking the other day?
Well, we're gonna bring him up every episode now. Yeah. I think this dude is so fucking weird.
It was actually the day when you're like, oh, I found this shitty like SoundCloud rapper, and I'm like, oh, I know that guy. And literally that day, I was walking in his neighborhood and I saw him biking down the street.
He's so much worse than a SoundCloud rapper. He's a pop punk guy.
No, that's even worse.
Yeah, listen to his music. He makes like Screeching Weasel influenced bad pop. It's like he heard Negative XP, who like make great pop punk, even though that guy's a fucking weirdo, right? And he was like, I can do that. Can I tell you an awesome thing? Sorry, I know we need to finish up. Can I tell you an awesome thing Durst does in his videos?
Oh, God, tell me. Are you talking about like his filming videos? Because I've actually appeared in a couple of those videos of his.
Yeah, okay, he does these intros in them. I don't know if you've seen them, where he shows streamers saying his name, but it's clearly like he donated to them in chat and they're reading his name off. But it's just like a bunch of like some pretty popular people saying, Durst the worst, Durst the worst, Durst the worst.
I've seen that one.
As if everyone is like, if he's on everyone's lips. It's like you just donated to their super chat, you dumb fuck.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely hilarious.
Sorry.
But no, it's all good. But, speaking of the worst things, so that is our review for Hardcore. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I love this movie. I think this is a just prime example of 70s neo-noir, like New Hollywood, sort of grimy, just like the sort of degeneracy that was allowed to exist, post Hays Code and New Hollywood stuff. And I'm not even saying degeneracy in like a bad way, but, before...
It is what it is.
It is what it is, exactly. Like we mentioned on the Bonnie and Clyde and the Born Losers episode, like this sort of subject matter would never have existed pre-1968. It just would not have. But yeah, so I love this movie. I think, except for, of course, Kristen, as we mentioned earlier, who one and only role she was ever in. And originally she was, when the original ending, of course, where she dies in a car accident, when they brought her back, they were just like, oh shit, we need a scene where this girl talks. So that's why she's just not very good. So initially she was just supposed to be in the opening scene.
Not her fault.
Her exist. Yeah, exactly. She wasn't even meant to be like an actress saying more than a couple lines. So, I mean, it just is what it is. But yeah, other than that, I think this movie's great. Of course, you have classic actors like George C. Scott and fucking Peter Boyle in it. As we mentioned earlier, Season Hubley is great. All the seedy, scummy people are great. Who was also great? I totally forgot to mention. In one of the scenes where Van Dorn is going to one of the sex clubs and he gets kicked out by one of the bouncers, that was one of Reb Brown's first film roles. He got thrown out of a sex club by twink Reb Brown. That's hilarious.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
You know about Reb Brown, right?
I feel like I know that name. Maybe from you, I might.
He was the original 1970s Captain America.
Oh, fuck. I've seen that. I used to have that on VHS.
Yes, he was also in You're the Hunter from the Future, which is a fucking nuts movie. I don't know if you've ever seen that one.
That's a great title. Was that an MST3K pick, or is it later than that?
He was also in Space Mutiny, which was absolutely a...
Yes, yeah, classic. Classic Mystery Science Theater.
He was also in Robo War, which I think is one too, if I'm not mistaken, although I could be wrong about that.
I don't remember that one.
But either way, Reb Brown, classic, shitty, like D-list, like Italian action movie actor. And then, like I said, he was the 1970s fucking Captain America. Oh yeah, he was also in Strike Commando, which is a fucking nuts movie. He was in a bunch of Bruno Mattei, like shitty Italian action movies.
So I had seen this movie before. I'd seen it in high school. My mom's a fan of it. She's also a big fan of 8 mm, so she's the person that showed me both those films. Rewatching it now, I liked it a lot. I didn't love it. So I love the atmosphere. I love the performances. Of course, I'm on record. I love George C. Scott. I love Peter Boyle. I think he's hilarious. I think, again, the atmosphere is great. Neo-noir is just a genre that it's one of those things that works for me. I have a real affinity for it. When you get into the themes again, and I don't mean to harp on it, I do feel like the movie itself can be a little confused about what it wants to say, because it seems like it's trying to be this reckoning between like a conservative Christian Midwestern worldview and this very liberated and, you could even say like degenerative, like world of pornography, the seamy world, and kind of conflict between the two. But I feel like it's never really sure like what it's questioning about them. I have a read on this movie, Taylor, that I didn't see anyone else have, and I feel not super confident in it, but I feel like it's pretty plausible.
All right, let's hear it. Let's hear it.
Schrader he did not direct Taxi Driver. He wrote Taxi Driver, famous, open to interpretation movie, right?
Yes, very open to interpretation movie.
Here's my take on hardcore. There is no snuff in this movie. George C. Scott travels. He examines pornography, which is this new thing to him, and it fucking melts his brain. It's this fucking weird middle-aged Calvinist from Michigan, and he's totally horrified by it. And he goes through these seamy underbellies and all these things, but he goes mostly to somewhat vanilla places. He finally does see, after making kind of a weird, kind of a sketchy off-the-record contact, does get to see the screening of a bondage film. My read on this is that that's a simulated murder, and that he has no media literacy because of his own upbringing and takes it completely at face value. So he's basically going around tormenting all of these people that are working in sex shops and pornography stores, these sex workers who he the poor kid he holds fake auditions for and beats up. And my read, potentially on this, is that he's still chasing down his daughter who's gone missing and is underage, but that everything we're seeing is through his perspective of this world that makes it like 5 times eviler than it is. And I think that that's like amplified by, so the score to this movie is incredible. I just want to say it's this
the score is phenomenal. I love the score of this movie.
It's like this weird mix of krautrock, ambient synths, and these really noisy blues rock guitars. It's very dissonant, but I think Van Horn is kind of an unreliable narrator, and not that he's a bad guy, not that he's dishonest, but that this world is so alien to him that he's coming in basically hackles up and like ready to be super violent and aggressive to it because he feels like he's fighting for his life and his daughter's, when most of the time he maybe isn't.
I think there's some credence to that idea.
And I'm not saying that's necessarily what I think. It's just like a read on it that I thought was possible.
I think there's some credence to it, though, because, he'll go to these sex clubs. He'll go to these, for lack of a better word, brothels, because that's what they are. And, like, in the movie, they're literally just shown out in the open, like, hey, get some fucking pussy. Like, and that would never exist in an American city. They would never just be advertisements, like, open doors for these giant brothels. That would just not exist. Like,
and he does basically go in there and bully people. Even the place he gets thrown out of, where he gets kind of his ass kicked, he does deserve it in that moment. He goes to a random brothel, basically is very uncooperative with the women working there, wants them to know about his daughter. Why would they know his daughter? Why would they just see this picture and recognize her? But he thinks porn, sex work, they all know each other. Like, he's like not fathoming how big this world is.
Yeah,
and then he starts yelling and screaming and they have to throw him out.
Yeah, even when Mast literally says, like, well, the film that his daughter was in, was made for a couple $100. It'll be retitled as something else when it's, filmed. Like, nobody sees it, nobody shows it, nobody films it. Like, the idea that he could ever find his daughter from, like, this random porn video is, like, literally trying to find a fucking needle in a haystack. Mast says it outright, and he's still just like, well, no, fuck it. I'm gonna fucking find her. And for some miracle, he does. But at the same time, he does it by brutalizing a bunch of people, which some of them do deserve it. But, like...
Yeah.
some of them don't either. Like it's fucking like he beats up, as Mask's character calls him a F-word hustler. Like that's all he is. Like I mean, he's just some guy.
Why would he know anything? And that is part of why I think that maybe, and because that's my read on the movie, to a degree, I'm taking it farther because I think it's interesting to think about. But my general read on the movie is that he's coming into a world that he doesn't understand, and he maybe thinks he understands better than he does because of his sheltered and kind of like privileged life in Grand Rapids. And he's kind of coming in like John Wayne. Again, the original title of this is Pilgrim.
I forgot to mention too, Mask calls him Pilgrim all the time in this movie.
That's why I kind of think for me, it might drive some of those things home more if his daughter just didn't go home with him. Not because he was a bad dad.
But just because he's being a psycho, basically.
Yeah. That's not a definitive read on this movie. Don't at me and tell me I'm fucking dumb. This is just a thought that I had while watching it that it kind of makes sense with the themes that I have about this. But I wish the movie had more confidence in whatever it wants to say. Because like I said, there's a read of this movie that I think is progressive or liberal or whatever. And there's a read of this movie where it is like a reactionary movie. Either way, I think it's a very good movie. But I wish, because I feel like this movie does want to say something. This isn't just an escapist kind of story. This movie clearly has a worldview and themes it's trying to explore. And I just wish it said whatever it was with more conviction. Because it's a very brave movie. But when it gets to that point, I don't know if it had to do with like maybe just Schrader not being sure, maybe because of his own background. Maybe he wasn't sure what he was feeling about some of the subject matter or, what stance to take. Or maybe there was like studio interference. But it just feels like there's something this movie wants to say that it can't quite put its finger on. If there's something I'm missing, I'm very open to that.
No, absolutely, 100%. Like, once we get into our final thoughts, I totally want to expound upon that. But, we were talking about all these things here. You know who agrees with all of our opinions on this movie, Brian?
Well, probably Siskel and Ebert.
They absolutely love this movie. I think, actually, Roger Ebert gave this 4 out of 4 stars, although I could be wrong about that. I don't remember.
He said some dumb shit, but I don't hate the guy as a human being.
No, not at all. But speaking of people who agree with everything we've ever said, let's get into our Amazon reviews. And oh my God, Brian, I got some great Amazon reviews, including an Amazon review here from one of the most influential figures of the 20th century.
AVGN?
I wish. Every time I read these Amazon reviews, I think, what were they thinking? No.
This movie is fucking dog shit.
Yeah. I'd rather snuff a fucking snuff. I'd rather sniff
I'd
a
rather
snuff
a shit out of my ass.
Yeah. But yeah, so our first review is once again from one of the most influential people of the 20th century. So our first review here is from Ho Chi Minh, who gives us 4 stars. And the head of the review says, if you like the subject matter, and the body of the review says, entertaining, if you like the subject matter, not especially deep though. And you know what, Mr. Ho Chi Minh, if I may call you Min, you were one of the most, once again, influential members of the 20th century. Of course, you helped lead your countrymen to kick out multiple empires from your country and, of course, establish the Great Republic of Vietnam. Please, please, please give me money, Vietnam. I will move there. Please. No, I'm just kidding, obviously. But I disagree very much with your reading of this movie. I think this movie is especially deep if you look into it from the realm of a crazy person, like we both are.
So one of the things that's interesting to me is saying interesting if you like the subject matter. Does he mean interesting if you like neo-noir, which I assume is what he means? Or does he mean interesting if you like pornography and snuff?
No, he said entertaining specifically.
Entertaining.
Yeah. But I mean,
but
either
what does
way,
he mean
though,
by
right?
subject matter, right?
I mean, at least for me, and the reason I wanted to do this trilogy of movies, and once again, the next movie is going to be 8mm to the audience at home. And the third movie, I'm not going to say quite what it is yet, but it might not be the movie you expect. But either way, so I'm entertained by the idea of this movie because I am very much interested in the concept of like snuff. And also all the movies that we're going to review are basically movies all released in different generations. So this is the movie about snuff films made by boomers, essentially for boomers. And
from a boomer perspective, like it is.
Exactly. So like I find that subject matter very interesting because back in the day, the original idea of the snuff film was the Manson family allegedly filmed the Tate LaBianca murders, which was of course obviously not true. That never happened. But like the concept of a snuff film came from like boomer paranoia about fucking dirty hippies like murdering people and filming it and like selling it and shit like that.
And boomer paranoia of technology.
That too, yes.
That's one of my thoughts. Well, so the real genesis for this, Taylor, if you remember, is you and me talking a long time ago, well before Millennials Are Old was actually a concept about doing some sort of content about 8mm.
Yes, I
I
very
think
much do remember that.
that was before we had the podcast that we discussed maybe sometime doing something like a podcast so we could talk about 8mm. That's a movie we both love that just not a lot of people give the time of day. For me, when you had the idea for the Snuff trilogy, what I was thinking was there's always been this uneasy relationship, right, between visual medium, representations of violence, and simulated sex, and the real thing being caught there. And there are murky lines between what's simulated and what's real. And I think that's what the snuff paranoia is about. What's interesting to me for our purposes as old millennials is, yeah, all of these films were made in different decades and by somewhat different generations. And you sort of see how these fears about representations of sex and violence change a little bit and how they stay the same. And I think one of the things that's interesting with we do our little generational segments, our cringe millennial thing, is that snuff would be very different now than when any of these movies were made because of all the changes with social media, with content creation, with influencers. But you see how those same kind of trends and fears kind of repurpose themselves in new eras. And I think that's really interesting.
No, absolutely. I 100% agree. And I would 100% love to expand upon that once we get to the infamous film 8mm, which,
I'm so excited to talk about it, dude.
I am too. A movie that, as you mentioned earlier, was very critically derided at the time, but now I think is seen as kind of like, I don't know if masterpiece is quite the right word, but the very engaging film that it is. Because I think it's a very engaging film, personally.
I love that movie. First of all, I'm something of a Schumacher defender. I think he has as many hits as misses, at least.
8mm obviously hit. I'm going to see Phone Booth one of these days, I promise.
You'll love it. It's insane. It's ridiculous, but you'll love it.
Trespass, another Nick Cage movie, absolutely a miss. That movie is dog shit awful.
Batman Forever hit, Batman and Robin miss.
Yeah, very 50-50 director for me. All right, so yes, our next review here is from Amazon customer, one of our most prolific reviewers, and they give this film 4 stars, and the head of the review says, Tulip. And the body of the review says, there are so many inside joke demons being exercised here. Schrader himself is a byproduct of the Christian Reformed Dutch immigrant tradition, with the apex of that life being in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Schrader attended Calvin College in Grand Rapids, trying desperately to get thrown out. Having graduated from there myself, I perfectly understand why. This film is the most autobiographical religious story I have ever seen. Wonderfully, painfully honest. If only it would come out on DVD. I find this very interesting that somebody actually attended the same school as him and sees this as an autobiographical film as well. I would wonder what his interpretation is. I was actually planning on messaging him because I think there's a messaging feature on Amazon, but I could be wrong about that. I'm not entirely sure. But
also this review is 20 years old.
Yeah, he might be dead for all we know. Yeah. And then our next review here is from Zach, who gives us 1 star. And the head of the review says, misleading or people who don't know what they're doing and just ripping you off. It's one or the other. And the body of the review,
my favorite genre of review.
Yeah.
Great.
And the body of the review says, no booklet included. But hey, you can get the limited edition Blu-ray. Oh, wait, that's essentially just the standard edition. This Blu-ray looks like the standard edition as I have other indicator limited editions, and this isn't one of them. So false advertising. So I have no idea what this person's referring to, but whatever this Blu-ray release is, sucks shit.
But at least that's a review of the actual product. They're not like reviewing Amazon.
Yeah, exactly, right? And then our final review here is from Bruce Topi, who gives us 1 star. And the head of the review says 1 star. And the body of the review says filth. Just filth. That's all.
Jacob Van Horn wrote that review.
Yeah, that was Jake Van Dorn's fucking like burner account. I saw this movie about my life. Filth.
Filth. I do not consent.
Yeah. Am I being detained now?
Am I being detained?
But speaking of filth, so yes, once again, that is our review of Hardcore. Brian, do you have any final thoughts before we get to our pluggables?
Very good film. I'm curious. I would recommend it to anyone who's a fan of neo-noir. The ghost, the shadow of Chinatown looms heavy over this film, as it does with pretty much any film in the neo-noir genre. But it's very good. Performances are great. Again, we love George C. Scott here. I do think that there's a lot going on, textually and subtextually. If anyone wants to watch this and give me their read on it and what they think it's saying, I would love to hear that, because I do think that there's things going on. I'm very open to the idea that there's something I'm just missing in it or haven't considered.
I agree with all that. I genuinely really love this movie quite a bit. Once again, as I mentioned earlier, all the performances outside of Kristen are phenomenal. I love seeing early Reb Brown, twink Reb Brown once again in this movie. I think it's fantastic to see him. Rest in peace, of course, to Peter Boyle and George C. Scott. I will 100% probably I'll do a 100% completion run of George C. Scott's filmography at some point, because he's just phenomenal in everything. Even if the movie's not necessarily the best, he's always fucking phenomenal in it.
Oh, so. Yeah, he is working. Whenever you see that man, he was working.
Absolutely. Just a hard-working actor. And I will say as well, we were talking about Paul Schrader. Paul Schrader is also another director who's a very hit-or-miss director, especially at this point. A very hit-or-miss director at this point. But yeah, this movie's very much a hit for me, even though it is a little bit confused and muddled in its, I think, message. I still think this is a very well-made movie. I think, as you mentioned, the soundtrack's great. I think the visuals, the cinematography is great. Once again, performances are great. It's just an overall great movie that is hindered a little bit by the ending and its sort of muddled meaning. But if you can get beyond that and you can just appreciate a solid series of performances from a new Hollywood legend like Paul Schrader, I would 100% recommend this movie.
There's a lot to love in this movie, and it's a fascinating movie. That's one of the things I think we always talk about on here, is that we try to pick movies that, whether they work 100% or they don't, or they partially like. 'Cause this movie, I would say, works, even though there's things in it like I don't love it. There's like knocks I have against it. It works, but it's fascinating, and there really isn't another movie like it. I know people say 8mm. To me, those two films have similarities, but they're not the same.
Agreed, 100%. Yeah, it's, like I said, people said 8mm is a ripoff. I don't quite agree with that. I think there's some very similar moments in both of these movies, but I don't think they're the exact same movie at all. I think that more than likely I would say 8mm might be like an homage to hardcore, but I don't think it's a ripoff.
And it is. Hardcore. Exactly.
But yeah, so that is our review here. Let's get into some pluggables. So, of course, you can follow me at Carlos Chantor on Twitter.com. Of course, my policy of the Prime Directive of e-girls is still there. So if you want to go to my people I follow list and find some hot e-girls, go ahead. But otherwise than that, I never post. And as well, you can follow us on both our YouTube and our Spotify channel, where we are uploading episodes simultaneously to both platforms. So please follow us there. And as well, of course, we've mentioned on several episodes now, please donate to the Lucifer and the Father GoFundMe for the Lucifer and the Father sequel. Once again, Scott, Sean, and now Robert are all good friends of the show. We love them. We once again appreciate you very much for being on our show and talking to us, and of course, just giving us great content to put out there as well. So please donate today to help the Lucifer and the Father sequel get off the ground.
Go ahead and follow the Millennials Are Old Facebook group. So the Millennials Are Old Instagram. They're more or less the same. The Instagram is a little bit more concise. You can see every episode basically lined up in order and pick whichever one you want. And working on, well, for you to know, Taylor, I'm going to start a Millennials Are Old Twitter account. I figure that'll probably maybe be an easier way to reach out to people, because when you DM them, artists and things, they don't see it unless they accept it, and they sometimes don't even see that request. So I think I'm going to start a Twitter account and start harassing people on there.
Well, so the problem is, Brian, is that you can no longer DM people unless you're subscribed to Twitter Blue.
Oh, fuck!
Yeah!
Well, I guess see, the thing is, that's so embarrassing. I don't even want to do it for the podcast because it's so fucking corny.
Yeah, no, Elon Musk, Muskie Boy will get 0 cents from me. Every time there's an ad, I block the ad.
Because I can still DM, or is it you can still DM your mutuals?
Oh yeah, but yes, you can DM your mutuals, yes.
Because I get DM requests from people I don't follow all the time still on X.
Yeah, you can only DM people you don't follow if you're on Blue. That's what I meant, yes. So, but as long as you follow them, you can DM them.
Okay, so all these people I don't know, because I'm getting DMs right now from people who aren't verified on X, like in my requests, who I don't follow.
Yeah, I think you have to both be mutual followers to message, but I could be wrong about that. I know you can't just like randomly message people anymore without Twitter Blue.
Well, it used to be that they had to be your mutuals. Well, in any case, I'm still going to get working on that because I think I'm going to abandon my current Twitter account anyways.
But, speaking of things we're about to abandon here, so that is our episode for the day. And of course, we are old millennials. We've talked about enough old millennial shit on here. I think it's time for us to take our old millennial asses to sleep. So have a good night, Brian. Have a good night, everybody.